Can the Dolphins sustain the success from last season? That's the big picture overriding storyline entering the 2017 campaign. Because under first-year head coach Adam Gase, as we all know, at the time was the youngest coach in the NFL, the Dolphins broke through, won 10 games, and made the playoffs for the first time since 2008, surprising all of us, especially after a very slow start. The last time, as we all know, the Dolphins made the playoffs, they also had a rookie head coach leading the way. It was Tony Sparano 8 years prior in the aforementioned 2008 season. With that in mind, I wanted to draw a comparison between both Sparano and Gase in their first seasons to determine if we can learn anything from the 2008 and 2009 years compared to 2016 and looking ahead to 2017. The question remains, is success sustainable? And simply put, if you want to compare contrast the two teams, you had a largely gimmick offense back in 2008 versus a real offense that everybody believes in here in 2016, and a very good defense back in 2008 versus a very subpar defense in 2016. Let's take a look back at 2008. The offense averaged 21.6 points per game, which was 21st in the league, tied for first with just 13 turnovers the entire season, and benefited from, really, let's be honest, the gimmick that was the Wildcat. Exciting, fun, and different, but ultimately the NFL caught on. That offensive system wasn't sustainable. It didn't ultimately last, but it was fun to look back on, right? Like right now, it's fun to think back at that Wildcat offense and reminisce about how after an 0-2 start, the coaching staff devised a new approach, largely thanks to the prompting of quarterbacks coach David Lee, who during his time at Arkansas ran the Wildcat with Darren McFadden, Felix Jones, and Peyton Hillis. The unleashing of the Wildcat on Bill Belichick and the Patriots to the tune of a 38-13 dominant victory in Week 3 of that season remains one of my favorite games in Dolphins franchise history. And maybe that's showing my age a little bit. I'm relatively young compared to looking back at the good old days in the 70s and the 80s, but that will be one of my favorite games ever in the franchise's history. But I digress. The defense in 2008 was terrific, allowed just 19.8 points per game, which was 9th in the league. They gave up 329 yards a game, which was 15th. Rushing defense was 10th, giving up just over 101 yards. And compare that to the Dolphins this past season. In 2016, the offense averaged 22.7 points a game, 17th in the league. But it's a modern, with the times, offensive system that was brought in by Adam Gase. The defense, on the other hand, wasn't all that good. 18th in points allowed, so that wasn't terrible, but they gave up 382-plus yards per game, 29th in the league. The rushing defense was terrible, 30th in the league, giving up over 140 yards per game. Looking back, the success wasn't sustainable after 2008 because they were in part built around the Wildcat. Remember that offseason, they drafted Pat White in the second round. They had 2 second-round picks, and with the first of those 2 second-round picks, they drafted Pat White, which ultimately was a luxury selection that had no business being a second-round pick. They envisioned the Wildcat as a long-term offensive option, and that White could fill a niche role as the quarterback of that Wildcat, but he was so undersized and ill-equipped to play quarterback in the NFL, we found that out pretty quickly. Who were the big free agent signings that offseason? How about safety Jabril Wilson, who ultimately was released after one season despite signing a 5-year, $27.5 million deal? Center Jake Grove also cut after one season despite signing a 5-year, $29 million deal. And cornerback Eric Green, who was cut during preseason the same year he signed. Absolutely terrible, terrible free agent class brought in by the Dolphins in that offseason. Now, to their credit, they did sign the CFL's Defensive Player of the Year that offseason that most of us weren't aware of in Cam Wake, who had his breakout season a year later in 2010. They also re-signed Vernon Carey, Channing Crowder, Jeremiah Bell, Will Allen, and Lusaka Polite. But in 2009, they saw their record go from 11-5 to 7-9. The defense regressed significantly. The offense actually improved from a scoring standpoint, but the issue was they went from 13 turnovers in 2008 to 29 turnovers in 2009, and Chad Pennington only appeared in 3 contests. So the track record and most recent example of a rookie Dolphins coach taking his team to the playoffs saw them follow that performance up with 4 fewer wins and, as we all know, no appearance in the postseason. So what does that mean for Adam Gase? Are there any parallels that can be drawn? Let's examine what the Dolphins have done entering his second campaign in charge. 2017, what have the Dolphins done in the draft? We're a few weeks removed from that. Following a dreadful year defensively, in fact, a historically bad season in which they allowed a franchise worth 6,122 total yards. Well, for the first time in the 52-year history of the organization, they used their first 3 picks in the NFL draft all on the defensive side of the ball. That's a great start. Huge improvement from 2009 when they were drafting gimmick players to enhance a gimmick offense in the second round. Free agency, well, the headliners are actually the players they re-signed or extended with contracts like Kenny Stills, Andre Branch, Rashad Jones, and Kiko Alonso. They signed Lawrence Timmons, Anthony Fasano, Ted Larson, traded for Julius Thomas and William Hayes. Those were some of the main names to know. Of course, with the draft picks, with the free agent decisions, time will tell whether these moves will pay off, but there seems to be a strong purpose and a sound rationale behind most of these moves as compared to what we saw back in 2009. Also, let's take a look at the coaches. Tony Sparano came to the Dolphins with a background as an offensive line coach. His specialty was an area of the roster that they annually severely struggled with, right? The offensive line was never good when Tony Sparano was a coach, even though that was supposedly his specialty. And I've never seen a head coach get so excited about field goals. His enthusiasm for field goals almost matched the excitement exuded by Dave Wannstedt when the Dolphins punted the ball back in his coaching days. I mean, it's hard to believe what we saw on the sidelines during the Tony Sparano era. Meanwhile, Adam Gase came to the Dolphins with the reputation of being an offensive mastermind, a guru of sorts, ahead of his time when it came to that side of the ball, and a quarterback whisperer. So far, he's also proven to be a strong leader in the locker room who has both the respect and admiration of most of the players there and seems to have found a way of connecting with them on a friendly level, but has struck a balance between that friendship and being a disciplinarian who demands perfection and results and the respect that I talked about before. Also, it's worth noting that the current front office appears to be as unified as we've seen in a long time for this Dolphins organization. The group in 2009, and it's easy to look at this in hindsight because we weren't really aware of this at the time, but man, they were on their way to extreme dysfunction. Between Bill Parcells essentially checking out and going into retirement while still being highly paid by the Miami Dolphins, to Jeff Ireland going behind Sparano's back to try to help owner Stephen Ross hire Jim Harbaugh away from Stanford while Sparano was still under contract, and behind his back, the Dolphins were a mess internally, which is in sharp contrast to what we think we're seeing now with this front office, the coaching staff, and so forth. The bottom line, I have much more confidence in this 2017 version of the Dolphins to sustain success after appearing in the postseason last year. However, they do face some serious hurdles. There's a tendency to be complacent once you achieve a level of success. I think it's just human nature. And we see this time and time again in the NFL. There's so much parity. Teams in the NFL have been prone to not extreme necessarily, but experiencing some dramatic drop-offs. Teams that were satisfied, that no one previously expected great things from. They achieve those things. They become a favorite. Everybody's talking about them. They're going to be on national TV. And then all of a sudden, when they have to get back on the field and the expectations have changed, there's competitive balance and parity in play in the NFL. And all you have to do is be just off a little bit, and suddenly you lose some of those games that maybe you won the season before. Also, the Dolphins, in fairness, looking at this in an unbiased fashion, go from the 3rd easiest schedule heading into last season to the 6th most difficult in 2017. And Las Vegas has noticed, and this is interesting, because according to both the South Point Casino and Bovada, the Dolphins' over-under for wins next season is 7.5. That's right. They go from 10 wins in 2016 to now being projected as an over-under win total of 7.5. And while this isn't the end-all, be-all, right? We can't just say, oh, well, Vegas says so, then they're going to have a disappointing season. It is worth mentioning that the folks in the desert tend to have a pretty good feel for these types of things. And to give you an idea, the Chargers are even at the Dolphins wins projected, and below Miami, only Buffalo, Jacksonville, the LA Rams, the Jets, and Cleveland in the AFC. So that gives you an idea of where Vegas' head is at in terms of this. Also, it is worth noting, if the Dolphins are going to be 3 wins less in terms of the win total from last year to this year, they only played 6 games against teams with winning records in 2016. They played only 4 games against teams that made the playoffs. They played 5 games against teams that ended up firing their head coach, Buffalo, Chargers, Rams, 49ers, because they played Buffalo twice. And the Dolphins were 9-1 against teams with losing records. So they took advantage of bad teams with bad coaches, and they did so the way you're supposed to if you're a playoff team. However, when they faced quality opposition, it was a different story. The Dolphins won just 1 game against a team with a winning record last year and were 1-5 in games against teams with 500 records or better. The Dolphins had to go to overtime in 2 games against losing teams before coming out on top. So it gives you the idea that they won a lot of close games. They beat the teams they should have, but they didn't beat the very good teams on their schedule. And this year's schedule gets better. They uncharacteristically won a lot of close games, and Gase inherited a 6-10 team. So Vegas' prediction that the Dolphins will revert back to something closer to that in 2017 basically says they overachieved in 2016 by that thinking. Now, did they? Only time will tell. And with that said, by comparison to last time around, as I brought up Tony Sparano, in my opinion, the Dolphins are much better equipped to contend for another playoff spot in 2017 than they were back in 2009 for many of the reasons that I documented.